Hi there, everybody. My name is Kate, and welcome to my channel, Trinergy Awakens Naturally. So, I want to talk to you about toxic relationships. We're on some real stuff right now. There's a lot flying around in the emotional spaces of people right now because the trigger point for lots of folks is right there, and we're seeing some real uptick in our worst behaviors. And so, what I want to say is we're working with people to decide whether we're going to go or to stay, whether we're going to separate, whether we're going to go away. What can really be best said here is that boundaries are what's most important. And one of the ways that we help to establish boundaries is by understanding what codependency is, understanding what our triggers are, and understanding why it is that we would not know already and understand that toxic relationships and the power differential and fear, intimidation, bullying, manipulation, those kinds of things are unhealthy, inappropriate, nothing at all that we deserve. It doesn't matter what anybody says, what anybody does, or anything we've ever said or done. There's no one on this planet, despite the going opinion for many, there is no one on this planet that we have the right to inflict pain upon, and they haven't the right to inflict pain upon us. At the high esoteric level, we understand that you may do anything you'd like to here in the Matrix except reach into the world of another person to cause them harm or to disrupt their journey. Those are not considered legal maneuvers. And so while we're learning how to pick apart and piece back together our relationships with abusers, people who have been, very unkind to us. And I'm going to put a kibosh on this right here and say I do not mean physical abuse. Physical abuse is a completely separate animal, and it's one that needs to be handled with appropriate safe boundaries, as in distance and a safe place before you unpack any of this. And I'm not giving any medical advice, I'm not giving any mental health advice. I'm simply offering up suggestions for ways to consider what I'm looking at, so I know where to go in terms of getting the help that I need. So what we can do when we're picking apart toxic relationships with narcissists, the nonviolent, the emotional bullies, the people who are very quiet and insidious and yet have a very quiet, violent vibe about them, that we're just kind of sure that they would do something underhanded or sideways if we weren't looking or watching. And so when we feel that and we start to identify that that is in fact you that's creating that feeling in me, that I'm triggered by you and there's a good reason to be, rather than succumbing to the gaslighting and the idea that it's something I'm misunderstanding, you're just fill in the blanks and all the justifications and excuses, etc., 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 the enabling that we're both asked to provide and that we do provide because of some coercion from the other side, either threatening to leave emotionally, threatening to take finances away immediately, threatening to enact some sort of something that is exerting and squirting a power control. And so we generally will get into that enabling with people who are willing to enable our toxic behavior too, which is enabling them to do what they do. And so when we're ready to break that cycle, the way that we come back and start those gray rocking conversations is to assume a great deal of compassion and understanding for people, that their trauma is what takes them to their poor decisions, the same as everyone else. The way that they were shaped and modeled and grown into being a person and being told these are the behaviors, these are the models of behavior that you follow. Many of us, we fall privy to that, and we fall prey to that system. And it's that very process of the spiritual awakening or the coming to our own where we break out of that system. However, for those that are in those systems, they're grown adults and they're in their fourth, fifth, sixth generation of that same cycle, then there are those that want to break away. And so we can hear the we can hear the need for a compassionate voice and compassionate ear. And 444, we are able to understand what explains a person's behavior. I can understand every addict I've ever met. I understand, and every addictive behavior I've ever had. I understand why I was doing that. I don't need a dossier full of all my psych classes that let me in on the human behavior of why I was doing that. That was very clear to me. It was, how do I stop doing that? However, at the same time that I was in my own addictive behavior, just like all other addicts, we're continuing our addiction and not seeing or not willing to take responsibility for the fact that it is in fact harming other people, and we are causing a ripple effect that reaches out into the world around us, and the people around us maybe don't like it and don't want us to try to explain away our behavior unless they have their own brand of addiction, chemical or otherwise, that allows them to sit where, you enable me here, then I'll enable you there, and you go drink and I'll be over here complaining heavily and being victimized about it. Those are both disempowered states, even though the power differential shifts between the two of them in that. So the way that we can really begin that gray conversation is the gray rock conversation with narcissists or real heavy-handed manipulative people, whether they have the diagnosis or not. I'm not going to wait for the DSM to tell me when I see behavior in front of me. I'm going to deal with it by understanding and having compassion. I understand why you're acting like a monster. I do understand that, and do my best, to not personalize it to people and say, I know why they're being a real dill hole. I know why they're being such a jerk. I know why you're being so. Those are inflammatory and highly unnecessary. And so I can say in my mind, and even out here to the person, I understand why you have these really aggressive and violent behaviors and these toxic behaviors. However, they do not parlay over here the same way anymore. And so by expressing that I understand, however, I don't excuse the behavior, understanding and explaining how you got to this behavior, that's absolutely gorgeous. That's what you do in the after action review of you to decide how your performance was in this particular interaction. And that's what I do. However, we don't do them together to come to some bullied consensus about what really happened. We come in with the facts of what did happen. And the facts are that this is abusive behavior. This is what started it. And this is how it ended. This is the conflagration. And this was the flashpoint back here that had nothing to do with me, for real, and had nothing to do with you, for real. We're answering original nexus points and genesis points of flame flashpoints that are from many cycles, many years, many decades, lifetimes, many themes, epochs, whatever you want to say, many dimensions away, that original assault to us happened. And so we're really explaining stuff that is out here in today's behavior that has nothing to do with why we got started down that road to begin with. The healthy human doesn't have a need to fall into violence or addictions, either one. It wouldn't be a naturally occurring process to be seeking an addictive cycle to fill a need that we don't have. So clearly this is something with us, and of course it is. We've studied addictive cycles, we've studied addiction, we've studied narcissism, we've studied human behavior very much to know that justifying our behavior only continues the behavior. Explaining it and then no longer allowing ourselves or anyone else to excuse it is where the change really happens. And when we no longer allow ourselves to excuse our own behavior, we darn sure aren't going to sit in the presence of somebody else who will allow us to either excuse our terrible behavior or excuse their own, because they assume that, well, you do this, then I'm going to be over here. So you're over there engaging in tax fraud and I'm over here smoking crack. What's your problem? Or you're in a very toxic and unhealthy dynamic with your mother who, you're the puppet to. There's no difference between that being your slave than me being over here blowing up whatever I'm blowing up with my addiction and gambling or whatever it is that just happens to look seedier. It's the same process of being stuck on something that I'm working to explain and justify why I do that. Please feel free to explain without the justification, because the explanation is really all that's necessary when it's necessary. And then that is only to have the compassion and say, wow, I do understand that monstrous behavior. I get that, and you're still going to have to go away. If we don't see a change, if I don't see a change in people's behavior to begin to take on the responsibility, the burden of their own responsibility, that explaining and then justifying is the burden you're going to carry. Because when we're still trying to justify, we're not really trying to come to a conclusion with something. We're just trying to save face, and not when we've done egregious things to other people. It's time to stop the, bullshit conversations with one another and begin those gray rocking where it's safe to do so, and those absolute black and white, no, where that's the most appropriate thing to do, and to leave safety as the ultimate boundary between me and thee, and the safety between thee and me, so that we all feel that sense of there are appropriate boundaries that are going to be honored and respected. You don't heal in the middle of a combat zone. It's impossible to, get the full restoration benefit and rehabilitation of recovery if you're in a combat zone, still taking on fire. So we have to move away from those situations sometimes in the safe way that we can, and using the language that we can, and using the language that I see. It does explain your trauma, your history. I understand your addiction, and I understand your narcissism. I understand your traits of abuse, etc. I understand them because I understand mine and how they 1122 fit into the one with you. However, it doesn't explain any further my behavior or yours in terms of how we're going to go further. It only explains how it got here and the why of it. However, how it goes forward is really what I want to talk about. But addictive cycles like to stay stuck in those first couple of questions of, how did we get here? Whose fault is it? Like to ask those questions rather than the how do we fix it? Addiction likes to stay in addiction because it's an addiction. And being a perpetual victim is also a state of addiction because it's hard to break out of that loop. It's not a conscious choice necessarily. It is a conscious choice, however, to step out of it and begin those conversations where we're allowing other people to go ahead and enable yourself. Believe what you believe and think what you want. Use the language that you use. However, I'm going to continue to language in the right direction, that I do not excuse your problem at the excuse level. I'm going to understand, and I'm going to give it the reason and the formulation of how it got here, and understand all of that. Got it. I understand all of the theme, the start, the growth, the finish. I got it. I get this cycle. However, tolerating it, just endlessly tolerating it with compassion and healthy boundaries, will allow me to see what is the tolerance level of your rehabilitation ability. And if there's very little or there's no feedback that's coming, I personally allow people to just keep on justifying and explaining away, why you are the way you are. We've all been, monsters in one way or another, and anybody that tells me they haven't, that's one that I'm definitely going to say, okay, well, I'm going to take my monster away, because there might be a day when I'm going to be a real butthole, and I'll need you to, possibly help me work through that, because you love me, you are my friend, you're a healthy individual who's a leader. No, you're not going to, no? Okay, cool. Well, at least that's an open discussion and a closed discussion, and we don't waste our time, even though it's disappointing. So anyway, take care of yourself no matter what part of the day you're in, and remember to get within your skin, because you're divine. It's absolutely gorgeous, and it's so totally fine. Looks beautiful all the time, and it understands. Doesn't need a justification. You're beautiful insides. You're divine. Needs no justification, no explanation. There is no explanation. I just am. That is the monad. I am that. I am. I am what I am. I am. So when we know that, we don't explain ourselves, and we don't listen to anybody else explain themselves and then justify themselves and then sit down and use that as the excuse that it's been and continues to be, without seeing where the steps are to create a better version of divinity somewhere else with somebody else who wants to really play with me. So take care of yourself, and I'll see you again next time. Take care, friends. Bye-bye. Mwah.